Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the strangest, strictest, and most fascinating sisterhoods of the ancient world, the Vestal Virgins of Rome. Imagine being 6 years old, minding your own business, when suddenly the high priest shows up at your door and announces you've been drafted into a 30-year religious career you absolutely cannot quit. You probably won't survive this with your childhood intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Before we get into the vows, punishments, and astonishing lack of workplace benefits, we need to understand what the Vestal Virgins actually were, because in ancient Rome, a place where people solved problems by sacrificing goats, consulting birds, or stabbing Caesar, the Vestals were considered the city's emotional support priestesses. If they were calm, Rome was calm. If they messed up, everyone instantly panicked, as if Jupiter himself had filed a complaint with management. This wasn't just a religious order. It was Rome's most elite institution, run on the powerful combination of superstition, patriarchy, and theatrical fear. The Vestals weren't chosen because they wanted the job. They were chosen because Rome believed 6 small girls could hold the empire together better than the Senate ever did. And honestly, history proves they weren't entirely wrong about that assessment. The Vestals lived in the House of the Vestals, a gorgeous marble villa next to the Roman Forum. Think luxury estate, but with the constant threat of divine punishment hanging over every breakfast. It had fountains, private gardens, elegant columns, basically the ancient world's version of a wellness retreat. Except instead of yoga classes, you maintained an eternal flame that could never, ever go out. Unless, of course, you enjoyed being publicly blamed for every bad harvest within a 50-mile radius. Their job was symbolic. Their presence was symbolic. Their purity was symbolic. Everything about them screamed, "Look at us." The gods still like Rome. They were walking billboards for divine approval. If a Vestal tripped in public, half the city interpreted it as a warning from the heavens, and the other half blamed the nearest politician. You would think the safety of an empire wouldn't hinge on a teenage girl's ability to walk gracefully in sandals. And yet, here we are, talking about exactly that. Despite the pressure, Vestals had privileges no other Roman woman enjoyed. They could own property. They had front row seats at gladiator games and theater performances. They didn't need a man's permission to exist, which in Rome practically made them superheroes. Touch a Vestal on your way to execution, and boom, instant pardon. Absolutely wild power move for a society obsessed with strict legal procedures. But beneath the marble floors, the elegant gowns, and the divine public relations, these girls were symbols Rome both worshipped and feared. They were revered when things went well and blamed when things went wrong. Basically, the ancient world's version of customer service representatives, except the complaints involved famine and military defeats. So before we get into their rules, duties, and occasional catastrophes. Remember this: the Vestal virgins weren't just Rome's priestesses. They were Rome's anxiety medication. And Rome was always stressed. The city believed that as long as 6 pure women kept a fire burning in a temple, the entire civilization would remain blessed by the gods. No pressure, girls, just the fate of millions resting on your ability to manage firewood and stay celibate for 3 decades. It's a setup that sounds absurd until you realize it worked for over 1,000 years. These women shaped politics, influenced emperors, and carried secrets that could topple governments. They were untouchable, powerful, and completely trapped. A paradox, wrapped in white robes and stationed next to an open flame. Becoming a Vestal virgin wasn't something a girl chose. It wasn't a calling, a vocation, or a passionate career goal like becoming a gladiator or a professional grape stomper. No, it was a state-sponsored kidnapping wrapped in religious ceremony. Rome called it captio, meaning the seizure, which is possibly the most honest name the Romans ever came up with for anything. Imagine being a 6-year-old girl in a nice patrician household, playing with wax dolls, when suddenly the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest of Rome, shows up at your door with a group of officials and says, "Congratulations, the gods want your daughter. No returns, no exchanges." Your parents couldn't negotiate. They couldn't bargain. They couldn't pretend you were out visiting your aunt in the countryside. The state simply took you. The selection criteria were delightfully superficial. The girl had to be from a noble family, because apparently the gods were snobs. She had to be physically flawless, with Rome's definition of flawless being absurdly strict. No stuttering, no limping, no unusual birthmarks. If you had a single freckle that looked suspiciously like a bad omen, you were out. But if you looked calm, quiet, and extremely kidnappable, jackpot. You were going to serve the goddess Vesta, whether you liked it or not. The girl also had to be mentally sharp enough to memorize complex rituals, but soft-spoken enough not to start a rebellion. Scholars debate whether these requirements were genuinely religious or simply designed to find children who would obey orders without question. Either way, the process was thorough, invasive, and completely ignored the child's actual preferences. When a girl was chosen, her father didn't get to negotiate or delay. Rome loved calling it an honor. But let's be real. Congratulations, your daughter will now serve the gods for 30 years and may be buried alive. If she slips up, is not the kind of news parents framed on the wall. Still, many families considered it a social victory. Their daughter was now untouchable, holy, and living better than most aristocrats. The moment of selection was pure spectacle. The Pontifex Maximus touched the girl and declared, "T. Amata Capio, I seize you, beloved." It's somehow sweet and horrifying at the same time, like being handed a cupcake with a spider baked inside it. Then came the procession. The child was walked through the forum past crowds pretending to be awestruck, instead of mildly relieved their own daughter hadn't been chosen. People whispered blessings while secretly thanking every deity available that their kids had dodged the divine draft. The girl entered the temple of Vesta, where the ritual haircut awaited. Her hair, symbolizing her previous life, was cut off and buried, probably next to the remains of her social freedom. From that moment on, she was no longer a normal child. She belonged to the gods, the state, and a long list of terrifying expectations. Rome called this the greatest honor. The children probably called it something else, quietly in their heads, because speaking out was definitely not allowed. Once officially seized into service, the next stage was simple. She left her family forever. No weekend visits, no holidays, no "Mom, can you pick me up?" messages. The Vestals were Rome's most sacred employees, and Rome believed sacred employees worked best when completely isolated from any support system. The moment a girl crossed the threshold of the Temple of Vesta, her old identity evaporated faster than a senator's moral integrity. The ceremony itself was dramatic. She walked alongside the Pontifex Maximus, surrounded by priests, musicians, and enough incense to smoke out half the forum. Crowds gathered, not because they cared deeply, but because ancient Rome treated every event like a spectator sport. Oh, look, little Julia got chosen. Good for her. And also, thank the gods it's not my child. Inside, the first order of business was that ritual haircut. Her long childhood hair was chopped off and then buried like a fallen hero. This symbolized her severing from the mortal world. Dramatic, but very on brand for Rome, a city that loved symbolism almost as much as it loved public executions. Then came the white veil, the plain robes, the new ritual name, all reminders that she had transitioned into a sacred life. Rome basically rebranded her like a new product launch. New, improved, now with 100% more purity. The girl was then escorted into the House of the Vestals, a sprawling luxury complex that looked like a palace but functioned like a divine boarding school. It had fountains, kitchens, servants, gardens, and elegant bedrooms. Everything except freedom. Think Hogwarts. But everyone is in detention forever, and the consequences for rule breaking involve actual burial instead of point deductions. And while it lavishly protected its virgins, the house also trapped them. Guards patrolled. Doors were watched. You were free to roam the gardens, the corridors, the courtyard, but not the actual city that existed 5 feet away. The message was clear. You have everything you need except your previous life. Yet, for many families, this was still considered a win. Their daughter was now untouchable, holy, and living better than most aristocrats. Parents bragged about it at dinner parties. Oh yes, our daughter's a Vestal now. No big deal. Just carrying the entire fate of the empire on her tiny shoulders. Located right next to the Roman Forum, the house was perfectly positioned for maximum symbolism. The Vestals watched the heart of Rome, and Rome watched them back constantly. Imagine living in a penthouse in Times Square, except your lease agreement includes the clause, "Stay here or face divine punishment." Inside, the place was enormous. 3 stories of living quarters, cooking rooms, storage chambers, ceremonial spaces, and hallways so long they looked designed for dramatic pacing during existential crises. The central courtyard held a beautiful pool and garden where Vestals could stroll gracefully while contemplating the weight of carrying Rome's destiny at age 8. Then again, Even luxury loses its shine when you're not allowed to leave. Guards weren't necessarily standing at the doors with weapons drawn, but the unspoken threat of breaking sacred rules was enough to make anyone behave. The Vestals technically had freedom inside, but stepping beyond the complex without permission, not recommended, unless you enjoyed disciplinary beatings administered with the kind of enthusiasm only ancient Romans could muster. Still, compared to the average Roman woman who had the legal rights of a decorative vase, the Vestals lived like aristocrats. They ate the best food, wore fine garments, and had servants to assist them. Their rooms were clean, well lit, and blessedly rat-free, a luxury Rome rarely provided to anyone. Scholars argue about whether this comfort was genuine care or simply Rome's way of keeping its most important religious assets content enough not to rebel. But the flip side? You lived with constant surveillance, divine expectations, and the knowledge that one mistake could cause mass panic, a mandatory purification ceremony, and several senators yelling about portents again. Every sound, every gesture, every late-night sigh echoed through a building that wasn't just a house. It was a symbol, a political tool, a religious monument, a place where childhood dreams went to be pressed into service like olives crushed for oil. In this marble palace, the Vestals would spend decades learning to walk, speak, breathe, and exist with the level of calm usually reserved for statues. They practiced carrying water jars on their heads without spilling a drop. They memorized hundreds of ritual prayers in perfect Latin. They learned which herbs to burn during which ceremonies, which gods preferred which offerings, and how to interpret the way smoke curled toward the ceiling. Their daily schedule was relentless. Wake at dawn, purify yourself with sacred water, tend the eternal flame, prepare ritual offerings, attend public ceremonies, study ancient texts, practice chants, clean sacred implements, repeat day after day, year after year, for 3 entire decades. And through it all, they had to maintain an expression of serene contentment because showing frustration was considered disrespectful to Vesta herself. The quirky detail that historians love, the Vestals had their own hairstyle, an elaborate updo called the Sinai crines, involving braids wrapped around the head in a specific pattern. It took hours to create and was required for all public appearances. Imagine being responsible for preventing Rome's collapse while also maintaining a hairstyle that required an engineering degree to construct properly. House of luxury? Yes. House of freedom? Absolutely not. The House of the Vestals was the ancient world's most beautiful reminder that comfort does not equal freedom. It was a gilded cage where Rome's most powerful women lived, revered, protected, and completely controlled. They had everything except the one thing that mattered most: the ability to choose a different life. Once a young Vestal settled into her marble-scented prison of luxury, it was time for her main duty, the task Rome took more seriously than elections, omens, or the structural integrity of their bridges, keeping the eternal flame burning. This wasn't just any flame. It wasn't a decorative torch or a cozy hearth fire. This was Vesta's sacred fire, the spiritual Wi-Fi connection of ancient Rome. If it stayed lit, Rome prospered. If it went out, Rome believed chaos would erupt instantly, crops failing, armies losing, politicians making even worse decisions than usual. Basically, all the things Rome blamed on the gods when they didn't want to blame themselves. For the Vestals, this meant one simple rule: do not let the fire die, ever. They tended it day and night in shifts, like tiny divine firefighters who were also expected to be spotless, silent, and serene. Imagine the pressure. You're 8 years old. Your sandals are too big. You're homesick. And you're responsible for preventing the fall of the Roman Empire. Meanwhile, your average adult Roman man couldn't even prevent the fall of his own toga. To maintain the flame, Vestals collected firewood, but not just any firewood. It had to be specific types of wood, gathered with sacred tools, blessed through proper rituals. They cleaned the hearth, performed ritual offerings each day, and probably developed sacred patience, considering they weren't allowed to roll their eyes even once. The whole process had to be done with reverence and grace. No rushing, no complaining, and definitely no accidentally puffing out the flame while leaning in too close. And if the flame did go out, that was a catastrophe of divine proportions. The Vestal responsible would be whipped, gently, according to the priests, though we all know Rome and gentle rarely occupied the same sentence. The city would perform emergency purification rituals, sacrificing animals, chanting prayers, and loudly wondering which god they'd offended this time. Scholars debate whether these punishments were genuinely about religion or simply Rome's way of maintaining control through fear. Either way, the message was clear: don't mess up. But here's the twist: the fire going out wasn't always the Vestal's fault. Sometimes storms blew through. Sometimes wind caught the smoke wrong. Sometimes the gods were just feeling dramatic. But Rome never blamed the gods. Oh no. Rome blamed the teenage girl with a broom and a job description longer than most senators' resumes. Still, despite the impossible stakes, the Vestals kept that flame alive for over 1,000 years through wars, plagues, coups, and whatever weirdness Caligula was doing that particular week. Beyond flame maintenance, the Vestals had other duties that made them Rome's spiritual multi-tool. They prepared holy water by collecting it from a sacred spring in specific vessels at specific times of day. They made mola salsa, a salted flour mixture used in sacrifices, grinding the grain by hand in a process that took hours. They guarded Rome's most important legal documents, wills, treaties, political secrets, because nothing says confidential like giving your private papers to a group of terrified virgins living under religious surveillance. They also attended public rituals, standing with perfect composure while watching bull sacrifices up close. If you even flinched during one of these ceremonies, someone would say, the gods disapproved. Maintaining purity wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Your emotions, gestures, clothing, posture, breathing, and probably your thoughts had to be immaculate. If a Vestal looked sleepy, people whispered. If she sneezed during a ritual, entire temples panicked. And then there was their most bizarre power: the accidental pardon. If a Vestal touched a condemned prisoner on his way to execution, even by accident, he was immediately freed. Imagine tripping in the forum and accidentally releasing a murderer back into society. The quirky historical detail? This actually happened multiple times, and Rome honored it every single time because apparently divine intervention included clumsiness. Through all this, the Vestals were expected to embody calm dignity, no slouching, no complaining, no, I'm tired of holding cosmic responsibility. Just the quiet understanding that they represented the stability of Rome, a city that was rarely stable. These women trained for 10 years, served actively for 10 more, then taught the next generation for a final decade. 30 years of standing next to fire, memorizing prayers, and carrying the weight of an empire that could blame you for literally anything that went wrong. The flame endured because 6 priestesses were very motivated not to disappoint a goddess with a track record of fiery vengeance. After 30 years of serving the gods, tending an anxiety-inducing flame, performing rituals with flawless precision, and living under the perpetual threat of burial, Vestal virgins reached a milestone that must have felt like divine salvation. Retirement. The moment a Vestal completed her 3-decade service, she was finally free to rejoin the mortal world, a world she hadn't lived in since childhood, and was probably half convinced no longer existed outside the marble walls of her sacred prison. Retirement transformed a Vestal into something rare in Rome, a woman with complete legal independence. She could own property, make contracts, manage finances, buy land, sell land, sue people, and most shockingly, live without a male guardian overseeing her every move. In a society where even wealthy matrons needed permission to sneeze in the general direction of a marketplace, former Vestals were walking anomalies of freedom. They had survived the impossible, and Rome rewarded them with rights that other women could only dream about. Many Romans sought retired Vestals for marriage, believing their purity and divine connection brought good fortune. After all, what better way to bless your household than marrying someone who had spent 30 years staring into a holy fire while maintaining perfect posture? Wealthy men lined up, hoping to secure a wife who symbolized cosmic approval, stable luck, and a reduced likelihood of household curses. Scholars debate whether these marriage proposals were romantic or simply transactional, a way for ambitious families to claim divine favor through association. But here's the twist. Most retired Vestals didn't marry. After decades of complete autonomy and spiritual authority, the idea of suddenly reporting to a husband must have sounded about as appealing as returning to the burial chamber they had narrowly avoided for 30 years. Imagine being free after 3 decades of impossible responsibility, and then immediately forfeiting your independence because Publius wants someone to manage his villa and produce heirs. No thanks. Many former Vestals chose solitude, wealth, and independence over the constraints of Roman marriage. Those who did marry sometimes struggled to adjust. Life outside the house of the Vestals was noisy, unpredictable, and full of people who didn't understand basic ritual etiquette. Ordinary citizens made mistakes constantly, touching sacred objects incorrectly, ignoring omens, failing to maintain pure thoughts during festivals. A former Vestal might witness one household mishap and nearly perform a purification ceremony on instinct, muscle memory kicking in after decades of conditioning. Still, retirement had its joys. A former Vestal could walk the city without being watched like a divine barometer. She could enjoy festivals without worrying that her smile was being analyzed for cosmic meaning. She could go to the market and buy a piece of fruit without considering its ritual symbolism or whether purchasing it on a Tuesday might offend Jupiter. In short, she could live like a person, not a myth. She could laugh too loudly, cry when sad, and make decisions based on personal preference rather than divine protocol. Yet, the public never fully let go of the aura surrounding retired Vestals. People still whispered blessings when they passed. Children stared in awe. Some citizens believed that even in retirement, a Vestal carried a spark of the sacred flame within her, a permanent connection to the divine that 30 years of service had burned into her very soul. And maybe she did. Maybe after 3 decades of interpreting omens, tending fire, and carrying Rome's spiritual weight, something fundamental had changed within her. Maybe she could never fully return to ordinary life because she had become something more. The quirky historical detail that historians love: some retired Vestals became incredibly wealthy, with 30 years of gifts, inheritances from grateful citizens, and property accumulated through their unique legal status. Former Vestals were often richer than senators. They commissioned art, sponsored public works, and lived in luxury that finally belonged to them alone. No divine obligations attached. But the legacy of the Vestal virgins extends far beyond individual retirement stories. For over 1,000 years, these women stood at the center of Rome's spiritual identity. Through civil wars, assassinations, plagues, imperial scandals, and emperors who really should have been supervised more carefully, the Vestals kept the flame burning. They were the quiet constant in a city that never stopped yelling. When Emperor Theodosius I finally abolished the order in 394 CE, extinguishing the eternal flame forever, it marked the end of Rome's ancient religious identity. The empire that had built itself on tradition, superstition, and divine approval had finally moved on. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think about those 6 women standing in shifts around an eternal flame. Think about the impossible pressure, the marble luxury, the decades of perfect behavior. Think about girls who became symbols, who carried empires on their shoulders, who walked through Rome with power no other women possessed, and paid for it with their entire childhoods, their freedom, and sometimes their lives. The Vestal virgins weren't just priestesses. They were Rome's heartbeat, its anxiety medication, its spiritual foundation. And for 1,000 years, they never let the fire go out. Now let that image carry you gently into dreams, where flames burn eternal and empires rest peacefully in the quiet darkness of history.